You just want warmth or something else?
Tonight decides if you live or die.
He thought the Apache girl merely sought warmth in his tent, but not in that way. Before we continue, please like this video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The wind howled relentlessly for hours, gusting fiercely down the canyon. It buffeted the edges of Harlan Tate's canvas tent, whistling a mournful tune through the sparse brush and skeletal mesquite branches. The fire he'd built before sunset had dwindled to a bed of glowing embers beneath a half-collapsed stack of wood. His pot of beans had long since cooled, its meager light barely illuminating the tent's interior. Harlan sat with his back against the rear tent pole, his hat pulled low, his shoulders hunched within his coat. His Henry rifle rested across his lap, the barrel pointed towards the tent flap. He wasn't exactly tense, but neither was he relaxed. Years spent in countless similar camps had ingrained a constant, low-level vigilance. The war, a shadow from 4 years past, still clung to him. He'd ridden alone ever since leaving the army, trapping mules, trading hides, and avoiding towns except for essential supplies. The memories of his wartime actions remained a bitter taste in his mouth. The villages razed to the ground, the screams, the ensuing silence, and his own complicity in it all. He'd stood there, pretending not to see what he was undeniably witnessing. Out here, in the wilderness, he didn't have to account for any of it. He didn't have to speak. He was chewing on the last of a hardtack biscuit when a subtle sound caught his attention. It wasn't a loud noise, just a slight rustling of the tent flap. A gust of wind, perhaps, or a hand. His eyes snapped open, his grip tightening on his rifle. He remained still, years of ingrained habit dictating patience. He counted his breaths. 1, 2. Then he saw her. A figure ducked low beneath the tent flap, paused momentarily, and then stepped inside. And the firelight first illuminated her legs, bare, scratched, and coated in dust. A wool blanket, haphazardly wrapped around her, was burned at one corner and smudged with ash. Her black hair was tangled and matted to her cheek with sweat or tears. She was shivering, but visibly fighting to control it. Harlan didn't lower his rifle. Not yet. She said nothing. She didn't plead or cry. She simply stood there, half-crouched, clutching the blanket around her shoulders as if it might slip away at any moment. Her eyes were wide but dry. She appeared utterly exhausted, and her expression suggested she anticipated potential harm from this man, yet had nowhere else to turn. Harlan watched her, his voice low and flat. "You alone?" She offered the slightest nod, her chin trembling slightly. "Campfire's out," he observed. "You brought that with you." She remained silent, her gaze dropping for a fleeting second, perhaps from shame, perhaps from cold, most likely both. He slowly lowered his rifle, but didn't set it down. Reaching behind him, he retrieved a spare blanket. Thin wool, torn at the hem, but still superior to the one she possessed. He extended it towards her, but she didn't move forward. She simply stared at his outstretched hand, her legs now visibly trembling, whether from the cold or the effort of remaining still. He dropped the blanket at her feet. After a moment's hesitation, she bent to pick it up. Her knees buckled slightly as she moved, and she let out a breath that sounded more like pain than relief. Once seated, she positioned herself on the far side of the fire pit, cross-legged, her eyes cast downward, now enveloped in both blankets. The tent flap settled closed behind her. He didn't speak again, neither did she. The silence was heavy, but not unpleasant, simply tense. Harlan leaned back, observing her in the dim firelight. She was undoubtedly Apache. Her features, her build, her movements all indicated as much. But he didn't ask. He didn't need to. Not here. Not after what he'd witnessed during the war. She seemed young, perhaps in her mid-20s, thin from hunger, but not sickly. Her frame spoke of strength, of shoulders that had borne the weight of more than one harsh winter. He noticed her feet again, split at the heels, bleeding in places. She'd traveled a considerable distance barefoot, suggesting desperation, pursuit, or both. He understood the myriad reasons that might drive a woman like her so deep into the canyon. Sometimes it was soldiers, sometimes it was her own people, sometimes it was far worse. He pulled his coat tighter and stared into the embers. The rest of the night passed in a silent communion. She didn't sleep immediately. Instead, she sat motionless, her blanket clutched tight, flinching at the snap of a burning log. He noticed one hand tucked beneath the blanket's edge, likely concealing a knife. Good. That meant she wasn't entirely helpless. When she finally did sleep, it was shallow and restless. She curled into a fetal position, her feet tucked up, her jaw clenched, her shoulders trembling even beneath the two blankets. She never turned her back to him. Harlan himself didn't sleep at all. His thoughts tumbled relentlessly, like stones rolling downhill. Why had she chosen his tent, of all the abandoned shelters left behind by hunters or scouts? Why now? Why him? He couldn't help but wonder if this was the war finally catching up to him. Not with bullets, but with the consequences of his actions. The fire burned low. He added 2 more sticks to the flames. As dawn approached, she shifted in her sleep, the blanket slipping from one shoulder, revealing the edge of a dark bruise across her collarbone. His jaw clenched, but he didn't avert his gaze. She remained undisturbed. The sun rose slowly, casting a pale light through the canyon mist. When he finally stood, stretching with a quiet grunt, she awoke with a start, sitting upright, her eyes wide once more. "Easy," he murmured, his voice still low, tending to the fire. She didn't speak, but she didn't flee either. He stepped out of the tent and into the wind, which was even colder than before. He pulled on his gloves, adjusted his scarf, and walked towards the tethered mules. Behind him, he heard the tent flap shift, but not open. She was still there. That was enough for now. By midday, the sky had cleared sufficiently to allow a weak sunlight to penetrate the haze, illuminating the canyon floor. Harlan knelt by the fire pit outside the tent, coaxing flames from dry twigs and strips of mesquite. He'd already fetched water from a nearby creek and soaked some beans. Behind him, the girl hadn't spoken, but she had emerged slowly, hesitantly, wrapped in the same blanket. Her feet were now covered in torn canvas scraps he'd left out the previous night, a makeshift attempt at footwear. She hadn't asked. She had simply taken them. This told him 2 things. She didn't expect kindness, and she didn't know how to react to it when offered. She squatted near the fire, warming her hands. She remained silent, her gaze downcast. Harlan didn't pressure her. He didn't need to. He offered her a tin cup of weak coffee. She hesitated, then accepted it with both hands, drinking slowly. She didn't thank him, but she didn't waste a drop either. That was enough. Harlan observed her movements, the way she cradled the cup, the way she glanced at his rifle resting near a stump he used as a seat, the way her shoulders tensed when the wind picked up. She was accustomed to danger, that much was evident. But she hadn't run, not during the night, not at first light. That, too, meant something. "You got a name?" he asked. She didn't look at him, but after a pause, her lips moved. "Ta," she whispered, the word seeming almost fragile. He gave a single nod. She didn't repeat it, simply storing the name somewhere in the recesses of her mind. He didn't press her for more information. He knew better than to pry stories from someone who didn't trust him. But there were things he needed to understand. She was young, perhaps 24, maybe younger, but her eyes held the weight of someone far older. That kind of burden didn't stem from mere wandering. It came from being cast aside. He hadn't seen any tracks in the canyon for a week. No soldiers, no deserters, no hunting parties. If her camp had been attacked, it hadn't been recently, and if someone was still pursuing her, she wouldn't have slept as soundly as she had. Not near a fire, not at all. This indicated that she was no longer fleeing, merely drifting. After breakfast, he began checking his traps. She followed him, her presence initially indicated by the crunch of gravel behind him, then by her shadow as the sun shifted. She maintained a distance but matched his pace. When he crouched beside a snare, she crouched nearby, observing but not interfering. One of the traps held a single hair. Another was empty save for a broken twig. He reset both in silence. At the third trap, she stepped forward, gesturing towards his knife. He looked at her hand. Slender fingers, calloused palms, a few small scars along her wrist. Not soft, not careless. He handed her the blade. She crouched, swiftly and expertly removing the hair from the wire, cleaning it, and wrapping the meat in a piece of canvas. When she returned the knife, she met his eyes for the first time. There was no gratitude in her gaze, only a steady, searching look, as if she was still assessing whether he was safe enough to remain near. Back at camp, she skinned a rabbit and laid the hide flat on a rock without being asked. He noted the precision and method in her movements, skills honed by necessity, not choice. She didn't move like a servant. She moved like someone who'd survived too much to be idle. He began patching a rip in his coat, but halfway through his needle snapped. He cursed under his breath, dropping the fabric, and stood to search his kit for another. Ta stood, picked up his coat, and sat with it in her lap. From a pouch beneath her blanket, she produced a small bone needle, threaded it with something unwound from the coat's hem, and began stitching the seam herself. She didn't ask. She simply did it, and Harlan didn't stop her. That night, the fire burned longer. She cooked the rabbit with some wild onions he'd gathered earlier. They ate in silence. She didn't touch his rifle. He didn't ask about her past. But after they'd eaten, after he'd fed the mules and checked the perimeter, she stood by the fire and pointed towards the sky. "Storm," she said. He looked up. Dark clouds were rapidly gathering over the ridgeline. The wind had picked up again, colder this time. If snow arrived early, they'd be stranded for days. He nodded, added 2 more logs to the fire, and ducked into the tent. She followed closely behind, crouching low to avoid the tent flap. Once inside, she wrapped herself tightly in both blankets, sitting near the fire pit, her legs tucked close, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. He removed his coat and boots, placed his rifle beside him, and sat with his back against the rear pole. They didn't speak again, but as the wind howled outside and the canvas groaned under the pressure, she inched closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder. She flinched when a gust buffeted the tent flap, but didn't move away. He remained still, allowing her to determine a safe distance, allowing her to set the boundaries. Later, as the fire dwindled to a faint red glow, she lay on her side, her head resting on her arm, her eyes half closed. Before drifting off, she whispered something so softly he barely caught it. "Why didn't you touch me the first night?" Harlan stared at the embers, his jaw tight. "You didn't want me to," he replied, his voice as quiet as the wind outside. She didn't respond, simply exhaling slowly and steadily, closing her eyes. In the space between them, something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something akin to it. And for the first time in years, Harlan allowed himself to close his eyes while someone else remained awake, because he knew she wouldn't run. Not tonight. Not anymore. The storm arrived with ferocity in the early hours, not with snow as Ta had predicted, but with sleet, sharp, frozen rain that hammered the canvas roof and turned the ground outside into thick red mud. The wind pressed relentlessly against the tent walls, causing them to sway and creak like an old barn on the verge of collapse. Inside, the air was frigid enough to see their breath. Ta had pulled the blankets tighter around her and curled into a ball near the fire pit. Harlan fed the coals 3 times throughout the night to prevent the chill from seeping into their bones. He didn't sleep much. Even when his eyes closed, his ears remained alert. Each gust of wind caused him to instinctively reach for his rifle, not because he believed someone was outside, but because a part of him always did. By morning, the ground outside had turned to a muddy mess. One of the mules had chewed through its tether during the night and wandered uphill. Harlan found its tracks, cursed softly, and spent nearly 2 hours coaxing the animal back down the slope, his boots caked in freezing mud. When he returned, Ta had boiled water and was steeping a bundle of herbs. He didn't ask where she'd obtained them. He hadn't seen her leave the camp. She must have gathered them days earlier and kept them tucked away. She offered him a cup. The taste was bitter and unfamiliar, but it cut through the cold in his chest. He drank it all. Afterward, he began sharpening his traps. She watched for a while, sitting near the fire, rubbing warmth back into her hands. Then, without a word, she picked up a length of rawhide cord and began repairing one of the broken snare loops he hadn't yet addressed. Harlan paused, glanced over, then resumed his work. They didn't need to speak. That was becoming increasingly clear. Later that day, the storm passed, leaving behind damp air and slick stone trails. Harlan considered packing up and heading south, towards the winter trade routes near Dragoon Pass, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the weight of Ta's presence. Perhaps it was the way she continued mending his coat without being asked, or how she stirred the beans to prevent them from sticking to the pot. Small things, quiet things, but they added up. That afternoon, she finally revealed what had happened. They were sitting near the fire, Ta shaping a handful of soaked mesquite pods into a paste with the edge of a tin can. Her fingers moved slowly, her eyes focused on the task. "My people," she began, her voice low. "They say I bring misfortune." Harlan didn't look up from the rabbit he was cleaning, but he heard every word. "They said the sickness came because I stayed after the child died. They blamed the storm, the horses running off, the empty traps. They called me cursed." She paused. He still didn't look at her, simply waiting. "They left me in the dry hills with no shoes, no food. They took my brother," her voice cracking slightly. "They said he'd be better off without me." Harlan's jaw tightened. He finished cleaning the rabbit and set the knife aside. "How old is he?" he asked. 7, she replied. He nodded. "You know where they took him?" She shook her head. "I think a mission near the trading post. They said the priest there takes in orphans and keeps them." Harlan let the words settle. He offered no comforting words. He didn't know how, but he looked at her, really looked, and saw something different in her face. Not fear, not sorrow, but determination. That night, she didn't sleep curled in a ball. She lay beside him under the same blanket, her back to his chest, not touching, but close. He felt her breathing, slow, steady. And for the first time, she didn't flinch when the fire crackled or the wind made the tent walls tremble. In the darkness, he kept his eyes open, staring at the canvas ceiling. He thought about the mission near the trading post, a white-walled church, a faded cross, children with shaved heads and vacant stares. He remembered the priest's overly smooth voice, the way the man had looked at the Apache boys as if they were stray dogs he was training. He hadn't liked it then. He liked it even less now. He didn't say it aloud, but the decision was made. If the boy was there, he would find him. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, but because it was the right thing to do. The next morning, he handed Ta a pair of his thick wool socks and told her to pack light. They would leave after breakfast. She looked at him for a long time, not questioning, not thanking, just seeing him. And then she nodded. Not a girl anymore, not a guest, but a woman standing beside him. And maybe, by the time this was over, they would be something like family. Not by blood, but by shared experience. They broke camp before sunrise. Harlan didn't speak much. He rarely did. But his movements were firm, focused, the quiet assurance of a decision made and unyielding. He packed only what they needed: dried beans, coffee, flint, the traps he hadn't had time to reset, his rifle, and the remaining rabbit meat wrapped in cloth. Ta rolled the canvas tightly and secured it with rope while he cinched down the mule packs. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. He'd said enough by saying they were leaving. The trail south towards the mission trading post was rough, less a path than a fading memory of one. Game trails split and disappeared into the brush, the rocky ground slick from the storm. Harlan walked ahead, leading the mules. Ta followed closely behind, her feet now wrapped in the patched leather moccasins he'd unearthed from his pack the night before. They were too large, but she didn't complain. By mid-morning, the sky cleared and the sun broke through, casting long shadows across the canyon walls. A hawk circled overhead. Harlan stopped, listened, then veered west, off the trail. They crossed a dry wash and climbed a low ridge to avoid a fallen cottonwood. When they reached the crest, the land opened up below, flat basin country stretching south, punctuated only by distant cottonwoods and a thin plume of smoke on the horizon. The mission. They didn't discuss what would happen there. Not yet. But the weight of it accompanied them. By evening, they reached an old, partially collapsed line shack, but dry. Harlan tethered the mules to a pinyon tree and started a fire inside using branches salvaged from the broken roof. Ta sorted their supplies while he cleaned the remaining snare wire. When the fire burned brightly, she sat beside it, her legs folded beneath her, the lines in her face softening for the first time in days. "Why do you help me?" she asked, her voice low but not timid. Harlan didn't answer immediately. He was inspecting the stock on his Henry, his fingers tracing a crack along the grip. "Would have helped anyone in that storm," he finally said. She tilted her head, unconvinced. "Not the first night." He looked up not at her, but at the space beside her. His jaw tightened. "I've been around enough camps to know the difference between a woman asking for shelter and one expecting to be taken," he said, devoid of anger, stating a simple truth. Ta looked at the fire. "You didn't ask anything of me. You still don't." Harlan shrugged slightly. "Doesn't mean I'm good." "You're not bad," she said. He didn't reply, simply returning to his rifle. Later, after they'd eaten, she reached into her satchel and produced a small bundle of cloth. Inside was a carved bone token, an Apache symbol worn smooth with age. She handed it to him. "My brother carved this before they took him," she said. "If the priest still has him, he'll recognize it." Harlan turned it over in his hand. It was simple, a circle with a split at the top, a symbol for a hawk's cry. He nodded and tucked it into his pocket. That night, as the fire dimmed, she sat closer to him than before, not touching, but near enough to hear her steady, deep breathing. She didn't flinch when he pulled the blanket over both of them. Her head rested against his shoulder. And for a long time they said nothing. But in that silence, the air between them changed. There was no urgency, no expectation, just the unspoken agreement of two people choosing the same direction. The next morning, they were moving again. The land flattened as they approached the mission, the sagebrush and dust giving way to worn wagon ruts and weathered split-rail fences. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. Harlan slowed his pace. Ta's face had tightened, her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. "We go in together," she said quietly. He glanced at her. "All right. But if he sees me and tries to take you back, he won't," Harlan said, his tone calm but resolute. They reached the edge of the mission just as the bell tolled for midday meal. The courtyard was bustling. Half-starved boys herded by an older woman wielding a switch, a drunken deserter asleep beneath his wagon, and the priest standing near the well, sleeves rolled up, speaking to a townsman. Harlan stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. His rifle was slung across his back, but visible. His boots echoed on the packed dirt as he approached. The priest turned. He was younger than Harlan remembered, slick hair, a clean coat, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you, friend?" the man asked, his voice smooth. "I'm looking for a boy," Harlan said. "Apache, name's Kolo, about 7 Might have come through here a few weeks back." The priest raised an eyebrow. "We've taken in many orphans here. I'll need to check the records." Ta stepped forward. She didn't speak, simply holding up the bone token. The priest's face flickered. Then he forced a smile. "Ah, yes, that one. He's here." Harlan's jaw tightened. "Bring him out." "Perhaps we could speak in my office," Harlan said, his voice low and flat. There was something in his tone, something cold and unyielding, that made the priest hesitate. He nodded, turned, and called out. A moment later, a small boy was released by another woman. His clothes were clean but hung loosely on him. His hair was short, but his face was Ta's. The same sharp jaw, the same dark eyes. When he saw her, he froze. Then he ran. She dropped to her knees, enveloping him in a hug. He was crying. Tears streamed down her face, too, not a loud, heaving sob, but quiet gasps muffled against his shoulder. Harlan looked away, giving them a moment of private grief and solace. The priest cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the quiet space. "You can't just take him," he said, his voice tight with authority. "There are papers, custody rules to consider." Harlan turned back to the priest, his eyes intense, his proximity almost intimidating. "He's not yours," he stated, the words clipped and firm. "And you think you have any claim to him?" Harlan didn't answer, his silence a testament to his lack of rebuttal. He reached into his pocket, withdrew a folded document, and handed it to the priest. The priest unfolded it, his eyes scanning the official-looking paper. It was a legal trade permit from the Army Southern District, signed by a quartermaster under whom Harlan had served. It wasn't a custody order, but it granted him the authority to relocate any tribal youth for protection purposes. The weight of the document, the undeniable legitimacy of the signature, was enough to make the priest visibly recoil. He took a step back, the authority visibly draining from his posture. "Fine," he conceded, his voice laced with a reluctant resignation. "But he's your responsibility now." Harlan didn't respond, simply turned and walked toward the gate. Behind him, Taya followed, cradling her brother in her arms. They walked in silence until they were safely beyond the mission walls. Then, breathless, she spoke. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. Harlan continued walking, his pace unwavering. "Yeah," he said, his voice low. "I did, because the past didn't fix itself. You had to choose to do better. And I made a choice." The atmosphere shifted the moment they left the mission grounds. It wasn't the weather, it was the palpable silence, the heavy, expectant quiet that settles after a significant decision has been made, before the full weight of its consequences has had a chance to settle in. The boy, Kolo, had stopped crying, but he clung to Taya's side with the tenacity of a vine clinging to a rock face. One hand was tangled in her sleeve, the other still clutching the carved token she had returned to him. Harlan walked a few paces ahead, his eyes scanning the horizon, a practiced habit ingrained by years of vigilance. His boots made a slow, rhythmic sound as they crunched through the dry grass. He didn't speak. His thoughts were loud enough. He kept seeing the priest's face, that unsettling blend of arrogance and fear. He didn't like that kind of man, one who used peace as a facade for control. That boy hadn't just been kept at the mission. He'd been systematically molded, reshaped, his hair cut short, his native language suppressed, his clothes excessively clean, his spirit subdued. They made camp an hour before sundown near a dry arroyo lined with mesquite bushes. Their shelter was rudimentary, canvas draped over 2 tethered mules, secured with rocks. Taya started a fire while Harlan scouted the perimeter, setting 2 snares, even though he didn't expect to catch anything. It was a routine action, and routine soothed his nerves, provided a sense of order and control in the chaos. When he returned, Taya was mashing beans in a pot with the back of a spoon, while Kolo sat opposite her, wide-eyed, his knees drawn up to his chest. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving the mission, but his gaze was intensely observant, taking in every detail. "Is he always that quiet?" Harlan asked, setting down his rifle. Taya glanced at her brother. "He used to talk," she replied. "He'll come back to it. Does he remember you?" She nodded. "They told him I was dead." Harlan didn't comment, simply sat near the fire and poured himself some coffee. Kolo stared at him, his gaze unwavering in its intensity. After a minute, the boy finally spoke, his voice hesitant and uncertain. "Are you the soldier?" Harlan looked up. Taya stiffened, momentarily bracing herself for an unknown reaction. Harlan nodded slowly. "I was," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Not anymore." The boy didn't respond, his gaze fixated on the rifle leaning against Harlan. "You afraid of me?" Harlan asked, his question plain and direct, devoid of any accusatory undertones. Kolo didn't answer verbally, but his eyes dropped, and he leaned slightly closer to his sister. Taya reached over and gently rested a hand on his head. "He doesn't need to be afraid," she said softly, her voice calming. "You didn't hurt anyone today." "You did the opposite." Harlan, unsure how to respond to such a profound statement, simply nodded once and stirred the fire. After they ate, Taya began brushing dirt from Kolo's feet, carefully wiping the soles with the edge of her blanket. Harlan watched the tenderness in her movements, the quiet patience. She spoke to him softly in their native tongue, and the boy leaned into her as if he were finally remembering what safety felt like. When Kolo fell asleep, curled beside her on the blanket, Taya looked up at Harlan. "You could have walked away," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Harlan didn't pretend not to understand. "I could have," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the embers of the fire. "But you didn't." He poked at the coals with a stick, stirring them thoughtfully. "Sometimes you don't walk away because the road behind you is worse." She watched him for a long moment, then spoke quietly. "You've done things." He didn't answer immediately. "Things I don't talk about." "I know what kind of things," she said, not accusingly but with a deep understanding. "I saw soldiers burn our storehouse, shot a man for running back inside to grab corn. I was hiding behind a woodpile. I was 8. Harlan looked at her then, not with pity, but with a recognition of shared trauma and a silent acknowledgement of her resilience. "I was there," he said, his voice low. "Not that one, but others." Taya nodded, her understanding evident in her silence. "You didn't have to say it." "I did," he replied, his tone unwavering. She shifted closer, her voice dropping even lower. "My people saw what happened to me and said it was because I'd been spared, because I should have died like the rest, and living meant the spirits had turned on me." He watched the firelight flicker on her face, illuminating the lingering pain in her eyes. "That's why they left you?" he asked, his voice soft with empathy. She nodded once, a single silent confirmation of her ostracism. "They said I carried the shadow of the dead." Silence stretched again, but this silence was different. It wasn't heavy. It was shared, a silent understanding forged in the crucible of shared experience. "You don't," he said simply. "You carry your own weight, same as I do." For a long time, she didn't blink, her gaze locked on his. Then, slowly, she reached out and touched the edge of his sleeve, a fleeting touch, nothing more. "You think we can make something here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Something, after what we both are?" "We already are," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We just haven't said it out loud yet." That night, she curled beside him again, but this time it wasn't just for warmth. He didn't reach for her, didn't pull her close, but he didn't move away either. Her breath warmed his chest, and her hand rested near his collarbone, a quiet gesture of comfort and trust. Outside, the canyon wind had finally settled. Kolo didn't cry in his sleep, and Harlan, for the first time in years, didn't dream of fire. They rode slowly the next morning, not out of caution, but because neither of them had articulated their destination. There was no longer a need to rush. Their purpose was clear, their shared future unfolding before them. The boy was with them now, clinging to his sister's waist on the back of the pack mule. His head leaned against her spine, eyes half closed, small hands gripping her belt with the trust of a child who had known abandonment and recognized safety when it finally returned. Harlan walked beside them, reins in one hand, his Henry rifle slung across his back. His boots stirred dust from the canyon floor as they crossed the narrow gulch west of the dry wash, the same path he'd used months ago when trapping alone. It looked different now, less empty, more hopeful. They set up camp before sundown under a ledge where the wind broke cleanly across the top. It was a place he remembered, dry with enough brush for cover and a natural fire pit surrounded by flat stones. Harlan cleared it out while Taya unpacked their supplies. Kolo gathered twigs without being told, a quiet, unspoken contribution. The boy still didn't speak much, but he followed instructions, watched everything closely, and remained within his sister's protective shadow. After supper, while the fire crackled low, Taya pulled the rabbit bones from the pot and handed Harlan his portion. He accepted it with a nod, noticing the newfound confidence in her movements. This wasn't merely survival anymore, it was the tentative beginnings of a routine life. They ate in silence for a while until Taya looked across the flames at him. "Why here?" she asked. "This canyon, this place." Harlan wiped his hands on a scrap of cloth, then tossed the bones into the fire. "It's quiet," he said. "It doesn't ask much from a man, and nobody comes unless they're looking for something." She held his eyes for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "What were you looking for?" He didn't answer immediately, just stared into the flames. Then, finally, he spoke. "Somewhere I didn't have to answer for things anymore." Taya didn't try to soften his words, didn't offer platitudes. She simply gave the truth back in kind. "That's what I was looking for too," she said. After Kolo fell asleep, curled in a thick blanket with his feet tucked under the saddlebag, Harlan sat sharpening his blade by firelight while Taya braided her hair down over one shoulder. It was the first time she'd done that in front of him. Before, she always kept it loose or tangled, unkempt, the appearance of someone unsure if they'd survive another day. She watched him for a moment, then spoke again, her voice quieter now. "You still carry it with you," she said, referring to the weight of his war experiences. "What you did in the war." He didn't look up from the blade. "It's not something you lay down," he said. "Not all the way." "Then what do you do with it?" she asked, her voice soft with concern. "Try not to be that man anymore," he said. "And if I can't fix what I did, I can at least stop it from happening again." Taya nodded slowly, her understanding implicit in her silence. "You already have." He looked up at her then, a question unspoken in his gaze. "You saying that matters?" She reached into the pouch she kept tied at her hip, pulling out a small needle and a bit of frayed thread. "Your coat's still coming apart," she said, gesturing towards the rip near his elbow. He shrugged it off and handed it to her. She took it gently and began to mend the seam, stitching in silence. The fire snapped once, sending sparks into the dark. When she finished, she folded the coat neatly and held it out, but didn't let go right away. "I know you didn't ask for this," she said, her voice low. "Me, Kolo, any of it." "I didn't ask for a lot of things," Harlan said, "but that doesn't mean I don't want them now." The way she looked at him then, steady, unblinking, was the closest thing to a question he'd ever seen in her eyes. He answered by scooting closer, closing the space between them slowly, not to crowd her, just to be near. She didn't move away. Her hand stayed on the coat, now resting between them. Her fingers brushed his. He let the silence speak first, then, low and earnest, he said, "If you stay, I'll build something better than canvas and coals. I'll find wood, raise walls, put a roof over your heads." Taya's voice was steady, unwavering. "And if I stay, I cook every morning. I make medicine when Kolo coughs. And I sleep beside you because I choose to." He swallowed hard, his eyes still locked on hers. "Then I want you to." She nodded, then leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder. Her hair fell across his chest. He didn't move for a long time. He just let her be there. Outside, the wind shifted again, softer this time. The desert around them was silent, not empty, just watching. Later, when they lay down, Taya tucked herself against his chest, her arm draped across his ribs. Kolo, half asleep, curled closer too, one small hand resting on Harlan's boot like a child claiming territory. That night, there was no need to keep watch. There was nothing to run from and nowhere else to be. They moved deeper into the canyon the next morning. The old trail narrowed between sloped rock faces and brush thick with rabbit tracks. But Harlan knew a place, an abandoned line station tucked against a rock wall, forgotten after the last cavalry patrols faded out years ago. The roof had collapsed, and half the log wall was missing, but the stone foundation held. Water was nearby, firewood was plentiful. He figured it could be made habitable again. It was the first time he'd returned since the war. Back then, he'd used it to sleep between orders. Now, he was coming back with a different purpose entirely. He stopped the mule at the ridge and looked down at the clearing. Taya stepped beside him, Kolo holding her hand. The boy had warmed up somewhat, speaking in soft whispers to his sister, even answering Harlan in quiet nods, but he stayed close, always close. Taya followed Harlan's gaze across the clearing. "This is where you want to build it?" she asked, her voice quiet. He nodded. "Enough stone left to frame out a wall. The roof will take time, but it's a start." She didn't question it, just said, "Then we'll need to dry meat while it's still warm out." That was it. No ceremony, no grand speech, just shared purpose, a silent agreement forged in mutual understanding. They unpacked everything by noon. Kolo carried stones from the old pit to mark a cooking ring. Taya set up the canvas as a shade lean-to while Harlan started digging out what would become the new root cellar. They worked until sundown. No complaints, no wasted movements. Every task, no matter how small, was part of building something that might last. By the end of the second day, they'd raised a frame of upright logs braced with rope and stone. Taya boiled strips of sinew to bind the beams. Kolo helped press clay between cracks in the wall to keep the wind out. Harlan worked until his hands bled, his efforts a testament to his commitment. That night, while the fire warmed the clearing, they sat close and watched the shadows dance across the half-built walls. "This feel like home?" Taya asked, brushing shavings off her skirt. Harlan didn't answer right away. "Feels like a place that could be," he said. "Better than canvas?" He nodded. "Better than running." Kolo had fallen asleep nearby, wrapped tight in one of the wool blankets, his head resting on a folded sack of beans. Taya shifted closer, her arms crossed against the chill. "You know," she said quietly, "when I was little, I used to think a man could never belong to the land unless he was born on it." "And now?" Harlan asked, his gaze meeting hers. "Now I think belonging is something you build, not something you're given." Harlan reached for her hand without saying anything. She let him. They sat like that for a long while, fingers laced, backs resting against the new wall. The stars were out, clear and sharp overhead. The canyon wind had died down again. It felt like the land was breathing softer now, a quiet acceptance of their presence. The next morning, he found Kolo stacking rocks into a circle and trying to shape a chimney with twigs. When Harlan walked past, the boy looked up. "Is this ours now?" Kolo asked, his voice a soft question. Harlan crouched beside him, watching the small hands place a flat stone on top. "It is, if we keep working at it." Taya stepped into view, carrying a basket of wild onions and mesquite pods. She smiled faintly. "Then we better not stop." By the end of the week, they had 4 walls. No door yet, but the wind didn't bite as hard anymore. Inside, there was a place to sleep, a corner for food, and a small spot where Kolo had arranged 2 stones and a stick, as if it might someday become a table. That night, the boy asked if he could sleep closer to Harlan, not out of fear, but comfort. Taya watched, and her voice was gentle when she spoke. "You gave him that," she said. "What?" Harlan asked, his attention focused on the sleeping boy. "The steadiness," she replied, her voice soft with recognition. Harlan didn't reply, just pulled the blanket tighter around the boy's shoulders and let him sleep. When Taya lay beside him later, her voice barely a breath against his chest, she said, "Do you ever wonder why it had to be us?" "No," he answered. "I only care that it is." And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just trying to forget the man he'd been. He was trying to become someone worth staying for. The days turned colder as the wind shifted out of the north. Frost laced the brush each morning, and their breaths hung in the air long after sunrise. The new walls of the shelter held the wind out, but not the cold, so they kept the fire going nearly day and night. Kolo started waking early without being called, collecting kindling, shaking the frost off the canvas, feeding the flames as if it were his responsibility. No one told him to. He just did it. They'd built something by now, not just a shelter, but a rhythm, a shared life. Taya had started planting winter onions in the soft patch of ground near the west wall where the sun lingered longest. She said if they made it through the winter, the land would give more come spring. Harlan had scouted deeper into the ridge and found pine for beams, a frozen creek for ice, and a fox den to stay away from. He was always moving, always fixing, patching, hammering. But at night, he was still beside her. That closeness had changed, too. They no longer laid down like strangers, keeping warm. No more silent inches between them. He would rest with his arm under her neck, her hand across his ribs, her breath warm against the underside of his jaw. It wasn't lust, wasn't ownership. It was choosing to stay near because being near had begun to mean something more than surviving. That night, after they had eaten, Harlan checked the doorframe again. It was crude, braced with uneven wood and a rusted hinge he'd salvaged from a wagon axle, but it held. Inside, Kolo was asleep already, curled near the fire, one hand tucked under his head. Taya stepped behind him and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You're always working," she said quietly. "Still things to do," he replied without turning. "I know," she whispered, "but I want to talk before it gets too dark." He turned, letting her arms guide him back into the warmth of the shelter. Inside, they sat close by the fire, knees touching. Taya's eyes stayed steady on his. "Do you know?" she said softly. "The first night I walked into your tent, I thought I'd have to trade myself just to not freeze to death." Harlan's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. "I didn't think you'd let me stay without wanting something," she continued, her voice low and vulnerable. He looked at her then, his gaze meeting hers. "I remember." She nodded. "But you didn't. Not once." "I wouldn't have taken anything you didn't give," he replied, his voice soft with respect. Taya's voice was lower now, her breath warm against his cheek. "I know. That's why I'm giving it now." Her hand rose to his face, fingers brushing his stubble, her eyes searching his. She kissed him once, soft, sure, and without hesitation. It wasn't quick. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss that said, "I've watched you long enough to know what kind of man you are." And he kissed her back the only way he knew how, steady, real, without rush or apology. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his. "I don't want to survive you," she whispered. "I want to stay." He pulled her in close, his arms wrapping around her like she was something he'd carried too long, only now setting her down gently, carefully. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Outside, the wind blew low through the canyon brush, but it didn't touch the fire. Not inside their walls, not where it mattered. Later, when she laid her head on his chest and they curled together under the blanket, he didn't reach for his rifle. For the first time since the war, he slept without the fear that someone would take what mattered most to him. And in the dark, just before her breathing evened out, Taya whispered, "One more thing. You don't owe me anything, Harlan, but I'm yours now." He didn't answer with words, he just stayed. Because sometimes love doesn't speak, it just doesn't leave. The winter came in slowly, then all at once. First it was just the mornings, white frost on the rocks, a harder bite in the wind. Then came the real cold, thick air, sky like slate. Snow fell across the canyon in uneven sheets, sticking to the edges of the shelter, gathering along the high stone ledges until even the pines looked bent from the weight. But the three of them stayed warm. The cabin wasn't finished, not by most folks' standards, but it stood solid now. Harlan had reinforced the roof with timber crossbeams. Taya had stuffed the walls with moss and woven reeds for insulation. They dug a channel to keep runoff from flooding the sleeping space. Kolo helped stack drywood in neat rows behind the shelter. It wasn't pretty, but it held the warmth inside. The air stayed warm. The fire never went out. The bedroom was shared now without hesitation, and every night ended the same. With Taya curled under Harlan's arm, Kolo tucked close at their feet, and the wind rattling harmlessly beyond the walls. There was no talk of leaving anymore. On the third morning after the first full snow, Harlan stepped outside with his coat collar pulled high, his boots crunching through the white crust. He scanned the ridge for tracks, deer, maybe fox. The snares had come up empty for days. They needed more meat soon. But he wasn't worried. For the first time in years, he felt something solid under his feet. Not just the land, but this life, this place, this cabin, this family he had found. He turned when he heard the door creak behind him. Taya stepped out, wrapped in his old cavalry coat, the sleeves hanging past her fingers. Her breath came out in mist. Her cheeks were pink from the warmth of the fire, not the cold. "You checking the traps?" she asked. "Later," he said. "Snow's too fresh. Nothing's moved yet." She stepped beside him, leaning slightly into his side. They stood like that a moment, watching the quiet canyon. "I had a dream last night," she said softly. "I was back in the old village. Same faces, same whispers, but I didn't care anymore. I had something they didn't." He looked down at her. "What's that?" She smiled faintly. "A door that closed behind me. A fire I could call mine." "You?" He let out a slow breath, shifted his hand to hers, and held it firm. Inside, Kolo stirred from sleep. They heard him rustling under the blanket. Then his small voice called out, "Is it morning?" Taya turned. "It is." Harlan gave her hand one last squeeze before stepping inside. By midday, they were working together again. Harlan was splitting logs near the back wall while Taya boiled a stew of root vegetables and dried squirrel meat. Kolo stacked kindling under the lean-to and sorted stones for the fire ring. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. Later, while Taya mended one of Kolo's shirts near the fire, Harlan reached into his kit and pulled out a folded piece of hide he'd carved days earlier when no one was looking. He ran his thumb over the etched lines one last time, then walked over and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. It was a nameplate, smooth leather pressed with careful lettering. Taya Kolo Tate. Her eyes didn't move at first. She just stared at the words. Then her fingers shook slightly. She looked up at him, unsure. "You can keep your name," he said. "But if you want mine, it's yours." She set the needle down, stood slowly, and stepped into his arms. She didn't cry. She just held him tighter than she ever had. Kolo looked up from his stones. "Does that mean she's your wife now?" he asked, his voice curious. Harlan looked down at Taya. "If she wants to be," he said. "I already was," Taya answered, without looking away from Harlan. "Since the day you didn't ask anything of me." That night, they lay side by side under a roof Harlan built, beneath a blanket Taya had sewn, by a fire Kolo helped keep burning. There was no fear anymore. No waiting for someone to come and take away what they had built together. It was all gone. Only the wind whispered outside, a gentle counterpoint to the soft breathing of three people sleeping soundly together. This wasn't out of necessity, but a deliberate choice, a testament to their shared bond. And with the first light of dawn, they would awaken to another day, another opportunity to continue building their lives, their dreams together.